January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the frozen Ardennes. The snow fell in silence, not the gentle kind that whispers peace, but the heavy, suffocating kind that mutes even the memory of warmth. An Obergefreiter, a corporal named Klaus Becker, lay pressed against the splintered roots of a shattered oak, his breath shallow, his fingers too numb to feel the trigger of his Parabiner 98K. Around him, the forest was a graveyard of steel and flesh. The trees bore scars from American artillery, their bark peeled back like wounds that would never heal. The air smelled of cordite and pine sap, and beneath it all, the metallic tang of blood freezing in the snow. Becker had been a soldier for 4 years. He had marched through Poland, France, and deep into Russia. He had seen cities burn and men die in ways that no language could properly name. But now, in this Belgian forest, he understood something he had never allowed himself to feel before. He was defeated. Not just his unit, not just his army, but the idea itself. The iron certainty that had carried him from Berlin to the edge of the world was broken. The Americans were closing in. He could hear their voices through the trees, calm and methodical, calling out in a language he barely understood. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Stuttgart. He thought of the promises made in 1939. He thought of nothing at all. When the American soldiers found him, he did not resist. He could not. His hands rose slowly, trembling not from fear, but from the simple fact that his body had nothing left to give. The GI who took his rifle was young, younger than Becker himself, with a face still soft enough to belong to a schoolboy. The American said something Becker did not understand, then handed him a canteen. Water. Cold, clean, impossibly pure. Becker drank, and for the first time in weeks he tasted something other than ash and iron. They marched him west, away from the guns, away from the forest, away from everything he had known. He walked with 30 other men, Germans, some Austrians, a Hungarian who wept silently as they moved. None of them spoke. What was there to say? They had been told what happened to soldiers who fell into enemy hands. The propaganda had been clear. The Americans were brutal. They were savages. They would torture, humiliate, execute. Becker prepared himself for the worst. He had seen what the SS did to partisans. He assumed the Americans would repay in kind. But when they arrived at the makeshift field camp 3 hours later, nothing happened the way he expected. To understand what Klaus Becker felt in that moment, one must first understand what he had been taught to believe. The Nazi regime had spent over a decade constructing an ideological fortress in the minds of its people, a narrative so complete and so consuming that it did not require belief, it required only silence. From the earliest days of the Hitler Youth to the final broadcasts from Berlin, the message was consistent. Germany was encircled by enemies who envied its strength, its culture, its destiny. The Americans, in particular, were depicted as a mongrel nation, weakened by democracy, corrupted by capitalism, incapable of true sacrifice. They were soft, they were decadent, they would break. And for a time it seemed true. In the early years of the war, German forces swept across Europe with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. France fell in 6 weeks, the Low Countries collapsed, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, a machine of discipline and will. German soldiers were told they were superior, racially, morally, martially. They were told that their enemies lacked the fortitude to fight, that the democracies would crumble under pressure, that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. But by 1945, the narrative had fractured. The Eastern Front had bled the Wehrmacht white. The Western Allies had landed at Normandy and pushed relentlessly inland. German cities were being reduced to rubble by strategic bombing. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was collapsing after 12. And yet, even in defeat, the propaganda persisted. Goebbels' broadcasts still spoke of secret weapons, of final victories, of enemies who would devour Germany if they won. Surrender, the soldiers were told, was not just defeat, it was extinction. So when Klaus Becker and his comrades were herded into that field camp, they expected the end. They expected cruelty. They expected confirmation of everything they had been warned about. Instead, they were given blankets.
The camp was nothing more than a clearing in a farmer's field, ringed by barbed wire and guarded by American MPs with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. There were tents, canvas, olive drab, hastily erected but sturdy enough to keep out the wind. There were latrines dug into the frozen ground, crude but functional. There were medical stations staffed by men in clean uniforms who moved with the efficient calm of people who had done this many times before. Becker was processed quickly. His name, rank, and unit were recorded by a bored-looking sergeant who spoke German haltingly, checking boxes on a form. His wounds, frostbite on 3 toes, a shrapnel cut along his ribs, were cleaned and bandaged by a medic who hummed while he worked. He was given a coat, American-made, too large for his frame, but warm. He was given socks. He was given food. The food was what broke him. It arrived on metal trays carried by American soldiers who moved through the rows of prisoners with the detached professionalism of factory workers. Becker stared at his tray and could not comprehend it. There was meat, actual meat, not the grisly scraps he had lived on for months, but thick slices of something rich and dark. There were potatoes, mashed and steaming. There was bread, soft and white, nothing like the sawdust loaves of the Wehrmacht rations. There was coffee, bitter and strong, and something sweet he did not recognize, canned peaches, syrupy and impossibly bright. He ate slowly at first, afraid it was a trick, afraid it would be taken away, but no one stopped him. The American guards stood watch, but they did not interfere. They did not mock. They did not even seem particularly interested. To them, this was routine. To Becker, it was incomprehensible. He had not eaten this well in years, not in France, not in Russia, not even in Germany before the war, when rationing had already begun to gnaw at the edges of civilian life. And yet here, in a prisoner camp thrown together in a matter of days, the Americans fed him better than his own army ever had. Beside him, another prisoner, a boy from Bavaria, barely 18, began to cry, not from sadness, not from fear, from the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of it. He had been told his entire life that Germany was the pinnacle of civilization, that its enemies were weak and decadent, and now, sitting in the mud with a bellyful of American food, he understood that he had been lied to.
This was not unique to Klaus Becker or to that camp in Belgium. Across Europe and the Pacific, as the Axis powers crumbled, hundreds of thousands of soldiers found themselves in Allied custody. And what they discovered there, what they experienced in those camps, fundamentally challenged everything they had been taught. The treatment of prisoners of war is, by its nature, a reflection of the society that captures them. It reveals not just military doctrine, but cultural values, economic capacity, and moral philosophy. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 had established basic standards, but compliance was voluntary, enforcement was difficult, and the chaos of total war often rendered such agreements meaningless. The Japanese, for instance, viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor and treated Allied prisoners with systematic brutality. The Soviets, brutalized by Nazi invasion, returned the favor with interest. The Germans themselves operated a tiered system, treating Western prisoners relatively well while subjecting Soviet POWs to starvation, exposure, and mass execution. But the Americans approached the issue differently. Not out of pure altruism, there was pragmatism too, a recognition that humane treatment reduced resistance and encouraged defection, but out of something deeper, something embedded in the nation's conception of itself. The United States had been founded on ideals of individual dignity and rule of law, however imperfectly applied. It was a democracy, however flawed, that believed in the possibility of redemption. And it possessed, crucially, an industrial and agricultural capacity so vast that feeding enemy prisoners was not a burden, but a mere logistical detail. By 1945, the U.S. Army was operating over 500 POW camps on American soil, housing more than 400,000 prisoners. In Europe, field camps like the one where Becker found himself were processing thousands daily. The scale was staggering, the logistics nightmarish, and yet the food kept coming. The Red Cross inspected regularly. Medical care was provided. Letters home were allowed. Work details were organized according to Geneva guidelines, with payment in scrip that could be used at camp canteens stocked with American goods, cigarettes, chocolate, soap. The German prisoners, especially those who had fought on the Eastern Front, could scarcely believe it. They had seen what war truly meant. They had witnessed the starvation in Leningrad, the scorched earth of the Ukraine, the death marches of Soviet prisoners. They had been told that the Americans, the British, the democracies were weak. But weakness does not produce abundance. Weakness does not build a logistics network capable of feeding millions across an ocean. Weakness does not have the confidence to treat its enemies with decency.
The experience of Japanese prisoners was, if anything, even more jarring. In the Pacific theater, surrender carried a stigma so profound that many Japanese soldiers chose death over capture. The Bushido Code, as interpreted by the imperial military, taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, worse than death, a stain that could never be washed away. Families of captured soldiers were shamed, names were stricken from records. To be taken alive was to cease to exist in any meaningful sense. And yet, as the war turned against Japan, thousands were captured. Some were wounded and unable to fight. Others were cut off, starving, delirious. A few, quietly, chose survival over ideology. And what they found in American custody shook them to their core. A Japanese sergeant named Hiroshi Tanaka, captured on Okinawa in June 1945, later described his first meal in American hands. He had expected execution. When that did not come, he expected torture. When that did not come, he expected starvation. Instead, he was given rice. Not much, but more than he had seen in weeks. He was given water, clean and cool. He was treated for dysentery by a Navy corpsman who worked with the same brisk efficiency whether the patient was American or Japanese. Tanaka could not reconcile this with what he had been taught. The Americans were supposed to be demons, barbarians who would defile prisoners and desecrate the dead. Instead, they were indifferent, not cruel, not kind, just professional. They followed rules. They had systems. They seemed to view the war as a job to be completed, not a holy mission. This was, in its own way, a more devastating psychological blow than any battlefield defeat. It suggested that the entire framework of meaning within which Tanaka had understood his life was false. If the enemy were not demons, then what was the war about? If surrender did not bring dishonor but merely boredom,
What had his comrades died for? In the camps on Guam and Hawaii, Japanese prisoners were put to work. They built roads, unloaded ships, tended gardens. They were paid, though the wages were nominal. They were allowed to write letters, though few did. What could they say? They were fed regularly, and while the food was not lavish, it was sufficient, more than sufficient. It was in fact better than many of them had eaten before the war, when they were still free.
Some prisoners gradually began to ask questions. They asked about democracy. They asked about labor rights. They asked why American soldiers seemed to have no fear of their officers, why they joked and complained openly, why discipline seemed so lax and yet so effective. The answers they received were not propaganda. They were simple, almost banal. Americans voted. They had unions. They could criticize their government. These things were not presented as virtues, but as facts, as obvious as the weather. To men who had lived their entire lives in a society that demanded total obedience, this was alien. And yet it worked. The American war machine, for all its apparent chaos, was crushing Japan. The B-29s that burned Japanese cities were built in factories where workers could strike. The ships that blockaded Japan were crewed by men who had been drafted but could complain about it. The democracy that was supposed to be weak, the capitalism that was supposed to be decadent, these things had produced a military force of unimaginable power. By late 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, its cities in ruins, its armies scattered. Millions of German soldiers were now in Allied custody, and the vast machinery of occupation and reconstruction was beginning to grind into motion. The camps swelled with prisoners, not just Wehrmacht, but SS, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, even Hitler Youth too young to shave. They came from every corner of the Reich, and they brought with them the full spectrum of Nazi ideology, from true believers to cynics, from war criminals to boys who had known nothing else. The American policy was clear. Treat prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions, document war crimes, and begin the process of denazification. But in practice, this was messier. Many German prisoners, especially those captured late in the war, were genuinely shocked by their treatment. They had been conditioned to expect brutality, and when it did not come, they did not know how to interpret it. Some clung to their ideology, insisting that the humane treatment was a trick, a temporary facade that would drop once the cameras were gone. But as weeks turned to months, the facade did not drop. The food kept coming. Medical care continued. Letters were delivered. Red Cross parcels arrived. Work details were fair. Punishments for infractions were proportional. The Americans, it seemed, actually followed their own rules.
This was profoundly disorienting. Nazi ideology had been built on the premise that the world was a Darwinian struggle, that only force mattered, that mercy was weakness and weakness was death. To be treated with basic decency by a victorious enemy suggested that perhaps the world did not work the way they had been told. Perhaps strength and cruelty were not the same thing. Perhaps there were other ways to organize society, other values worth pursuing. In the camps, a strange process began. Men who had shouted "Heil Hitler" a year before started to question. Not loudly, not openly, but in whispered conversations after lights out, in the long hours of labor, in the quiet moments when the propaganda could not reach them. They compared notes, they shared experiences, they talked about the food, the medical care, the way American guards would sometimes share cigarettes or newspapers. They talked about the things they had been told and the things they had seen, and slowly, painfully, some of them began to understand that they had been lied to.
There was a German lieutenant named Friedrich Müller, captured near the Ruhr in April 1945, who kept a secret diary during his imprisonment. It was forbidden, of course, but he hid the pages in his boot, writing in pencil on scraps of paper cadged from the camp office. His entries are terse, factual, but beneath the surface, a transformation is evident. April 20, 1945. Captured today. Expected execution. Given food instead. Do not understand. April 25, 1945. Medical inspection. American doctor treated shrapnel wound. Efficient. Professional. No cruelty. May 3, 1945. Received letter from home. Mother alive. City destroyed. She asks if I am being treated well. I do not know how to answer. May 10, 1945. American guard shared chocolate. Said his brother fought in Italy. Did not seem to hate me. Strange. May 18, 1945. Work detail today. Built fence for camp expansion. Paid in scrip. Bought soap and cigarettes. This is not what we were told. June 1, 1945. Conversation with Feldwebel Schmidt. He fought in Russia. Says the Americans are nothing like the Soviets. Says he does not understand why we were told they were the same. June 15, 1945. Saw film tonight. American propaganda, but also news footage. Concentration camps. Bodies. Mountains of them. They say we did this. Some men deny it. I do not know what to believe. But I remember the orders. I remember the things we were not supposed to see. July 4, 1945. Americans celebrating their Independence Day. Music, food, games. Guards invited prisoners to watch. Surreal. They are proud of their freedom. They believe in it. It is not a lie to them. August 10, 1945. Received package from the Red Cross. Socks, toothpaste, writing paper. In the midst of victory, they send us supplies. We destroyed their friends, and they send us toothpaste. What kind of enemy does this? August 30, 1945. Talked to American soldier from Wisconsin. He asked about Germany before the war. I told him about my father's bakery, about the mountains, about the university I attended. He listened. He did not judge. He said maybe after this, things could be better. I did not tell him I do not believe in better anymore, but I wanted to. Müller's diary ends in September 1945, when he was transferred to a long-term camp in France. He survived the war, returned to Germany in 1947, and became a school teacher. He never spoke publicly about his time as a prisoner, but his daughter found the diary after his death in 1982. She donated it to a museum in Munich, where it remains, a small testament to the quiet unraveling of an ideology. The symbolism of food in these stories cannot be overstated. Food is the most basic human need, and in wartime it becomes a marker of power, of civilization, of care. The Nazis had used starvation as a weapon, deliberately engineering famine in occupied territories, reducing Soviet prisoners to walking skeletons. The Japanese had done the same, forcing Allied POWs to subsist on handfuls of rice while their captors ate well. But the Americans, even in the chaos of war, even while fighting a two-front global conflict, maintained supply lines capable of feeding millions, not just their own troops, but civilians in liberated territories, refugees, and yes, enemy prisoners. The sea rations that American soldiers grumbled about contained more calories and nutrition than most Axis soldiers saw in a week. The field kitchens could produce hot meals in the middle of nowhere.
The logistical tale of the American military was so vast, so efficient, that abundance was taken for granted. For the prisoners, this abundance was proof of something they had been taught to deny: that democracy could be strong, that capitalism could produce, that freedom and power were not opposites. Every meal was a refutation, every cup of coffee, every piece of chocolate, every slice of bread. These were not just food. They were arguments, they were evidence. They were the physical manifestation of a society that, whatever its flaws, had managed to organize itself in ways that the totalitarian states could not match. And the prisoners noticed. They could not help but notice. Some of them, the true believers, tried to explain it away. They said the Americans were soft, that they would collapse eventually, that this was temporary. But as the weeks stretched into months, as the war ended and the camps remained, as the food kept coming and the structure held, those explanations became harder to maintain. In the Pacific, after Japan's surrender in August 1945, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were repatriated. They returned to a homeland in ruins, occupied by the very enemy they had been taught to despise. They returned to families who had been told they were dead, to communities that viewed them with suspicion and shame, and they brought with them stories that did not fit the narrative. They spoke quietly at first of American camps where they had been fed, of medical care, of fairness, of guards who treated them as humans rather than animals. These stories spread, whispered in the rubble of Tokyo and Osaka, passed along in the resettlement camps and demobilization centers. They were not celebratory. There was too much pain, too much loss for that. But they were confusing. They undermined the certainty that had sustained the war. One repatriated soldier, interviewed by an American anthropologist in 1947, tried to articulate what he felt. "We were told you were demons. We were told surrender meant torture and death. But when I was captured, I was given water. I was given rice. I was treated for my wounds. I was allowed to live. I do not understand why you did this. I do not understand what kind of enemy shows mercy. In Japan, we were taught that mercy is weakness. But you won, so perhaps we were wrong." This confusion, this cognitive dissonance was intentional. The American occupation of Japan, guided by General Douglas MacArthur, sought not just to defeat the enemy, but to transform it. And part of that transformation began in the POW camps, where Japanese soldiers encountered, for the first time, a different way of being. They saw that discipline did not require cruelty. They saw that authority could be questioned without collapse. They saw that individual dignity could coexist with collective purpose. Not all of them were convinced. Some returned home as bitter as they left, nursing grievances that would never heal. But others, quietly, began to rebuild their lives in a new Japan, one that would eventually embrace democracy, pacifism, and economic partnership with the very nation that had defeated it. The seeds of that transformation were planted in many places: in the ashes of Hiroshima, in the text of the new Constitution, in the policies of the occupation, but they were also planted in the camps, in the moment when a starving soldier was given a meal, when an enemy was treated as a human being. Klaus Becker never returned to Germany. He was repatriated in 1947, but Stuttgart was rubble, his mother was dead, and the world he had known was gone. He emigrated to Canada in 1951, changed his name, worked in a factory, married a woman who never asked about the war. He lived quietly, anonymously for 43 years. He died in 1994, and his obituary mentioned nothing of his service in the Wehrmacht. But in 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he wrote a letter to his nephew in Munich. It was discovered among his effects, a single page typed on an old manual typewriter. In it, he described his capture, the camp, the food, the blankets. He wrote about the moment he understood that everything he had believed was a lie, and he ended with a question. What do you do when you realize you were wrong about everything? When the enemy you were taught to hate shows you more humanity than your own side ever did? I have spent 50 years trying to answer that question. I do not know if I have succeeded, but I know this. The Americans won because they could afford to be decent. We lost because we could not. The tears that fell in those camps, and they did fall, countless times, witnessed by medics and chaplains and guards who did not always understand what they were seeing, were not tears of gratitude. Gratitude is too simple, too clean a word for what those men felt. They were tears of disillusionment, of shame, of relief, of anger at having been deceived. They were tears for the comrades who had died believing the lies, for the years wasted, for the world that could have been if different choices had been made. But they were also, perhaps, tears of recognition, a recognition that humanity is not the exclusive property of any one nation or ideology, that decency can exist even in war, that the enemy can be, in the end, not a demon, but simply another human being, doing what he believes is right with the tools he has been given. The American treatment of Axis POWs was not perfect. There were abuses, particularly in the immediate aftermath of capture, when emotions ran high and discipline frayed. There were camps where conditions were harsh, where food was scarce, where accidents and illnesses took lives. The system was vast and imperfect, run by fallible humans in the chaos of global war. But the standard it aspired to, the principle it attempted to uphold, was revolutionary in its context. It said that even in total war, even against enemies who had committed atrocities, there were lines that should not be crossed. It said that victory did not require cruelty, that strength could be measured in restraint as much as in force. It said, in effect, that the values a society claims to hold must be visible even in how it treats those who sought to destroy it. In the end, what the Axis prisoners discovered in those makeshift field camps, in those tents and barracks scattered across Europe and the Pacific, was not American perfection, it was American capacity. The capacity to wage war on a global scale while maintaining, however imperfectly, a commitment to certain principles. The capacity to feed millions while fighting millions, the capacity to treat enemies as prisoners rather than vermin, the capacity, in short, to win without becoming the thing it fought against.
This capacity was rooted in many things, in industrial might, in geographic isolation, in democratic institutions, in a culture that, for all its contradictions, retained some belief in individual worth. But it was also rooted in a simple, almost banal conviction that the way you treat the powerless reveals who you truly are. The prisoners, coming from societies that had elevated power above all else, found this conviction incomprehensible at first. But as the days turned to weeks, as they ate American bread and wore American coats and received American medical care, some of them began to understand. They began to see that the softness they had been taught to despise was not weakness, but surplus. The surplus of a society so productive, so organized, so confident that it could afford to be humane. And that realization, more than any battle, more than any bombing campaign, more than any occupation decree, marked the true end of the war for them. The moment that the ideology that had sustained them crumbled, not under the weight of defeat, but under the quiet, persistent pressure of a different way of being. The wind still blows across the fields where those camps once stood.
The tents are long gone, the barbed wire rusted away, the ground reclaimed by farmers and forests. There are no monuments, no plaques marking the places where men wept into their hands, where certainties dissolved, where the first fragile seeds of a different understanding were planted. But the echoes remain, in the letters hidden in attics, in the diaries kept secret for decades, in the stories passed down through families who never quite understood what their fathers and grandfathers had experienced. The echoes remain in the shape of the post-war world, in the democracies that rose from the ruins, in the alliances that held, however imperfectly, against the darkness. The lesson, if there is one, is not that America was virtuous. Virtue is too grand a word for the messy, pragmatic reality of war. The lesson is that systems matter, that the values a society embeds in its institutions, in its military codes, its supply chains, its training manuals, have consequences that ripple outward in ways that cannot always be predicted. The Axis soldiers who cried in those camps cried because they had been taught that power and cruelty were the same thing, and they discovered in defeat that they were not. They cried because they had been told their enemies were subhuman, and they were fed by those enemies, clothed by them, healed by them. They cried because the ideology that had consumed their youth, their countries, their futures, had been revealed as hollow. And in those tears, bitter and confused and unbidden, lay the beginning of something else. Not redemption. Redemption is too clean, too final. But perhaps a recognition that there are ways of being strong that do not require being cruel, that abundance shared is more powerful than scarcity hoarded, that in the end the measure of a civilization is not in how it treats its heroes, but in how it treats those who have no power left to resist. The camps are gone now, the prisoners are dead, the war is history. But the question they confronted, the question that broke some of them and remade others, endures. What does it mean to be human, even to your enemies? What does it mean to hold to principles when victory makes principles unnecessary? The Americans in 1945 did not have perfect answers, but they had food and medicine and blankets and rules they mostly followed. And for men who had expected death, that was enough to shatter a world. The snow still falls in the Ardennes, the wind still moves through the fields, and somewhere in the silence, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of understanding, painful, reluctant, irrevocable, that dawns when the enemy feeds you instead of killing you, and you realize that everything you were taught was a lie. That is the story, not of triumph, but of transformation, not of victory, but of the quiet, devastating power of decency in a world that had forgotten what decency looked like. And it begins, always, with a man in the snow, defeated and afraid, being handed a cup of coffee by the enemy he was taught to hate, and not knowing whether to drink it or weep. He drinks, and then he weeps, and the world slowly begins again.